The smoke never stopped rising from the Harwick family smokehouse, even when neighbors hadn't seen livestock on the property for months. This isn't just another Appalachian ghost story. It's about what happens when desperation meets vengeance in the most isolated corners of America. The year was 1847, and the Blue Ridge Mountains of Western Virginia held secrets in their hollows that civilized society preferred to forget. Deep in a valley where morning mist clung to ancient oaks and the nearest settlement lay a day's ride. Through treacherous passes, the Harwick homestead sat like a wound in the wilderness. The creak of wagon wheels on rocky ground, the acrid smell of woodsome smoke mixed with something sweeter, and the rough honeyed logs that formed the main house all spoke of a family determined to carve their existence from unforgiving land. Marcus Harwick had built his fortune on three things: moonshine, isolation, and human bondage. While most of Virginia's plantation system thrived in the fertile Tidewater region, Harwick saw opportunity in the mountains where federal oversight rarely reached. His property stretched across nearly 2,000 acres of dense forest, accessible only by a single winding trail that he and his sons knew by heart. In 1843, Harwick had purchased 6 enslaved people from a failing tobacco plantation near Richmond. The official records found decades later in a courthouse basement listed their names with the cold efficiency of livestock inventory. Samuel, age 28, Ruth, age 26. Their children, Moses, age 12, and Sarah, age 8, plus 2 unrelated men, Joshua and Thomas, both in their 30s. The journey to the mountains had taken 2 weeks by wagon. Local accounts gathered from scattered oral histories in the 1920s described how Harwick transported his human property in iron shackles, stopping only at trusted way stations, where his particular brand of commerce raised no eyebrows. The enslaved group arrived at the homestead in late autumn, just as the first snows began to dust the peaks. But the Harwick property wasn't a typical plantation. There were no vast fields of cotton or tobacco here, just steep slopes suitable only for corn, small gardens, and the illicit production of corn whiskey. The real work lay in the distillery operation, hidden in a natural cave system behind the main house. Marcus, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 grown sons, David, William, and James, had built their empire on producing the strongest moonshine in the Blue Ridge, trading it for gold and goods with buyers who asked no questions. The enslaved workers faced conditions that made traditional plantation life seem merciful by comparison. Winter temperatures in the mountains plummeted below zero. Yet their quarters consisted of a single log structure with gaps between the boards wide enough to see through. They worked the dangerous distillery operations, hauled water from icy streams, and maintained the complex network of hidden trails that kept federal revenue agents at bay. Samuel, the informal leader among the enslaved group, had been a skilled carpenter before his enslavement. Ruth worked as a cook and seamstress. Their children helped with whatever tasks their small hands could manage. Joshua and Thomas, both experienced field workers, adapted quickly to the mountain's demands. Together, they formed a tight-knit community bound by shared suffering and a growing understanding of their isolation. The Harwick family ruled their mountain kingdom with casual brutality. Eleanor, far from the Gentile plantation mistress of popular imagination, personally oversaw punishments with a leather whip she kept hanging beside the kitchen door. David, the eldest son at 32, seemed to take particular pleasure in devising new forms of torment. William and James, while not as openly sadistic, participated without question in their family system of control. The smokehouse stood at the center of the property's food production system. Built from field stone and thick oak logs, it measured roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, with a stone chimney that drew smoke from carefully tended fires of hickory and oak. Here the family preserved meat for the long mountain winters: deer, bear, wild boar, and the occasional pig or cow obtained through trade. Something darker lived in the mountains around the Harwick property. The Cherokee, who had once hunted these same valleys before their forced removal a decade earlier, had left behind stories that local white settlers whispered but rarely discussed openly. They spoke of a place where the earth itself seemed cursed, where game grew scarce and plants withered without cause. The Cherokee called it the Hungry Valley, a place where the spirits of the dead could not rest. By the winter of 1846, tensions on the Harwick property had reached a breaking point. The enslaved workers endured not just the usual cruelties of bondage, but the added isolation that made escape virtually impossible. The nearest town lay 40 miles away through mountain passes that became impassable in winter. Even if they could flee, they had nowhere to go. Virginia's fugitive slave laws meant certain return and likely death. Samuel had begun making careful observations. He noted which family members carried keys to the various outbuildings when the dogs were fed and by whom, and most importantly, the family's daily routines. The Harwicks felt so secure in their mountain fortress that they had grown careless about basic security measures. The smokehouse held particular significance in Samuel's planning. Its location, slightly separated from the main house but visible from the kitchen window, made it a critical choke point for any potential conflict. More importantly, it contained the knives, cleavers, and other tools necessary for butchering meat tools that could serve other purposes, if the need arose. What Samuel couldn't have known was that the Harwick family had been watching him just as carefully. They had noticed his increased attention to security details, his whispered conversations with the other enslaved workers, and most telling, his habit of testing doors and windows when he thought no one was looking. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform a remote Virginia hollow into something far more terrifying than any ghost story, a place where justice would be served with the same tools used to preserve winter meat, and where the smoke rising from an innocent-looking building would carry secrets that local residents would whisper about for generations to come. But first, someone had to die. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is there right now. If this story has already gripped you, smash that like button and subscribe, because what happened next in that smokehouse changed everything we thought we knew about survival, justice, and the lengths people will go to reclaim their humanity. The dogs stopped barking at exactly 11:43 on February 14, 1847. When predators know they're being hunted, silence becomes their greatest weapon. On that bitter winter night when ice crystals formed intricate patterns on the smokehouse windows and the mountain wind howled through gaps in the log walls, the Harwick family made a decision that would seal their fate. The crunch of snow under heavy boots, the metallic tang of fear in the sub-zero air, and the rough hemp rope coiled in David Harwick's calloused hands all pointed toward an execution that would never take place. Marcus had discovered Samuel's escape plan 3 days earlier. A loose floorboard in the enslaved quarters had revealed a cache of stolen supplies, dried meat, a compass taken from William's room, and most damning, a hand-drawn map of the mountain passes leading toward Pennsylvania. The evidence sat now on the kitchen table like a death warrant, illuminated by the yellow glow of whale oil lamps. "Should have done this years ago," Eleanor muttered, sharpening a butcher knife against a whetstone with methodical strokes. Her thin lips pressed together in the expression her sons had learned to fear since childhood. Soft hearts breed rebellion. "Your father's always been too merciful." David nodded toward the window where the smokehouse stood, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "We'll make an example of the carpenter first. The others will fall in line once they see what happens to leaders." The plan was simple and brutal. They would drag Samuel from his bed, force the other enslaved workers to witness his hanging from the smokehouse rafters, then leave his body there through the spring thaw as a permanent reminder. James had already prepared the noose using techniques learned from their grandfather, who had participated in vigilante justice during his younger years in Kentucky. But Samuel had not spent the previous months merely planning escape. He had been preparing for war. The Cherokee stories that local whites dismissed as superstition contained practical wisdom about survival in the mountains during winter. Samuel had listened carefully when old-timers in the nearest settlement spoke of how indigenous fighters had used the terrain, the weather, and the isolation against their enemies. Most importantly, he had learned that desperate people with nothing left to lose could accomplish things that seemed impossible. Through the thin walls of their quarters, Samuel and the others heard every word of the family's discussion. The Harwicks' overconfidence had made them careless about soundproofing, and winter air carried voices with crystalline clarity. By the time Marcus finished outlining their plan, the enslaved group had already begun implementing their own. Ruth had spent weeks studying Eleanor's routines, noting that the family matriarch always checked the fires in the smokehouse before bed. Joshua and Thomas had tested the strength of various tools in the outbuildings, discovering that the meat hooks were not just sharp but easily removed from their moorings. Moses, despite his youth, had proven invaluable in mapping the family's sleeping arrangements and identifying which rooms contained weapons. The irony would become clear only later. While the Harwicks planned to use the smokehouse as an execution site, their intended victims had chosen the same location for reasons of their own. The temperature that night dropped to 18 degrees below zero, according to weather records found in a 19th-century almanac preserved at the Virginia State Library. Such extreme cold created conditions that would prove crucial to the night's events. Metal became brittle enough to break under pressure. The ground froze so hard that footprints became difficult to track. Most importantly, the family's hunting dogs, normally kept outside, had been brought into the main house for warmth. At midnight, Samuel made his move. He slipped from the quarters through a window whose latch he had carefully loosened over several nights. The plan required precise timing. Eleanor would check the smokehouse fires around 12:30, just as she had for the past 4 years. The other family members would be asleep, trusting their isolation and their weapons to protect them from any threat. Samuel reached the smokehouse 15 minutes before Eleanor's expected arrival. Inside, the dying coals from the day smoking still glowed red in the fire pit. He used them to rekindle a small flame, then positioned himself behind the main support beam where shadows would hide his presence. The building's interior felt like a butcher's cathedral, hooks and chains hanging from the rafters, cutting tables stained dark with years of use, and the overwhelming smell of preserved meat and hickory smoke. Joshua arrived next, carrying a length of rope they had braided from scraps of hemp found in the barn. Thomas followed with a selection of tools whose original purposes would soon be forgotten. Even young Moses had a role to play. Stationed outside as a lookout who would signal if any family member besides Eleanor approached the building, Ruth remained in the quarters with Sarah, prepared to provide an alibi if needed. The official story, should anyone ask, would be that the men had been too sick with fever to leave their beds. She had even prepared a kettle of foul-smelling herbs to simulate the odor of illness. Eleanor appeared precisely on schedule, her dark cloak wrapped tight against the bitter cold. She carried a pine torch in one hand and a poker for adjusting the coals in the other. Her breath formed white clouds in the frigid air as she approached the smokehouse door, completely unaware that her routine had been observed and memorized for weeks. The door opened with its familiar squeal of iron hinges. Eleanor stepped inside, torch held high to illuminate the interior. The light danced across hanging slabs of venison and wild boar, casting moving shadows that would have concealed an army. She never saw Samuel until his hands closed around her throat. What happened in the next 60 seconds would transform 6 people from victims into something else entirely. Something that neighboring communities would struggle to understand or categorize for generations to come. The tools that had preserved meat for the Harwick family's winter survival were about to serve a very different purpose. And the smoke that had risen peacefully from the chimney for 4 years would soon carry secrets that no amount of wind could disperse. The Cherokee had been right about the Hungry Valley. Eleanor Harwick's torch hit the smokehouse floor and went out, plunging the building into darkness, broken only by the red glow of dying coals. In that moment, 4 years of careful planning collided with raw desperation, and the mountain itself seemed to hold its breath. The struggle lasted less than 3 minutes, but those minutes rewrote the rules of survival in the Blue Ridge Mountains forever. Samuel's hands found Eleanor's throat just as she opened her mouth to scream. Years of carpentry work had given him the grip strength to crush green lumber, and Eleanor's windpipe collapsed under pressure that could have snapped oak branches. Joshua moved immediately to block the door while Thomas grabbed the fallen torch and rekindled it in the coals. The light revealed Eleanor's bulging eyes and the terror that comes with understanding that death has arrived ahead of schedule. But Samuel had no intention of making this quick. 4 years, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind outside. 4 years you've beaten us like animals. 4 years you've worked us past exhaustion and fed us scraps while you grew fat on our labor. Eleanor clawed at his hands, her fingernails drawing blood. But Samuel's grip never wavered. He had positioned himself so that she could see the meat hooks hanging from the rafters, the cutting tables stained with years of butchering, and most importantly, the tools that would soon serve purposes their makers never intended. The historical record suggests that Eleanor Harwick was 53 years old at the time of her death, a woman who had overseen the brutal treatment of enslaved people for over 2 decades. Letters found in her effects, discovered during an estate sale in 1906, revealed her to be an educated woman who understood exactly what she was doing. One letter to her sister in Richmond, dated just 6 months before her death, contained this chilling passage. The mountain Negroes require firmer handling than plantation stock. Isolation makes them desperate, and desperate animals will gnaw off their own limbs to escape a trap. Samuel released his grip on Eleanor's throat just enough to let her draw one ragged breath. "You want to know about desperate animals?" he asked. "Tonight you'll learn what happened next challenged every assumption about the nature of revenge and justice in antebellum America. The enslaved workers didn't simply kill Eleanor Harwick. They began a process that would transform their former mistress into something unrecognizable while she was still breathing. Thomas had selected a thin-bladed feeling knife from the smokehouse's collection of butchering tools. The blade sharpened to razor keenness for processing fish and small game sliced through Eleanor's heavy winter dress with surgical precision. Joshua held her arms while Samuel maintained his grip on her throat. Applying just enough pressure to prevent screams while allowing consciousness to remain, the Cherokee had taught that an enemy's power could be consumed through ritual consumption of their flesh. While Samuel and the others had been raised as Christians, the mountain itself seemed to demand older forms of justice. The cold, the isolation, and the years of brutality had stripped away civilized restraints, leaving something more primitive and infinitely more dangerous. Eleanor's eyes tracked every movement as Thomas began the process of butchering. The filt knife traced lines along her torso, marking the cuts that would separate muscle from bone. She tried to speak, to beg, to bargain, but Samuel's grip allowed only strangled whispers that dissolved into the darkness. "The others will wake," Joshua warned, glancing toward the main house, where yellow light flickered in an upstairs window. "Let them," Samuel replied. "We're done running." The temperature inside the smokehouse began to rise as Thomas added fresh wood to the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, transforming the space into something that resembled the underworld more than a food preservation facility. The smell of woodsome smoke mixed with something metallic and immediate, the scent of fresh blood on cold air. Death came slowly for Eleanor Harwick. By the time her heart stopped beating, Thomas had already begun the systematic process of reducing her body to manageable portions. The techniques were identical to those used for processing deer and wild boar, except that this time the meat would serve a very different purpose than simple sustenance. This was about transformation, taking the flesh of an oppressor and making it serve the survival of those she had tormented. The other family members remained asleep, protected by thick log walls and the assumption that their mountain fortress was impregnable. Marcus snored in the master bedroom, dreaming perhaps of the hanging he planned to carry out in the morning. David, William, and James slept the sound sleep of men who had never known real fear, who had never looked into the eyes of people with nothing left to lose. Samuel cleaned Eleanor's blood from his hands using water from a wooden bucket kept for washing butchering tools. The water turned pink, then red, then black in the flickering firelight. He studied his reflection in the dark surface and saw something that had not existed 12 hours earlier, a man capable of anything necessary for survival. The work continued through the night. Thomas proved surprisingly skilled at butchering human remains, his technique learned from years of processing game for the Harwick table. Joshua maintained the fire at optimal temperature for beginning the smoking process. The meat hooks that had supported venison and wild boar now held different cargo arranged with the same careful attention to air circulation and heat distribution. By 3:00 in the morning, the smokehouse contained no recognizable trace of Eleanor Harwick. Her clothes had been burned in the fire. Her bones had been broken down and fed into the coals, where they would be reduced to ash and scattered with the morning wind. Her flesh hung from the rafters in neat strips, already beginning the slow transformation that would preserve it through the remaining winter months. Samuel opened the smokehouse door and breathed the mountain air. Dawn was still hours away, but the hardest part was finished. Eleanor was gone, and in her place hung the means of survival for 6 people who had been marked for death. The Cherokee story spoke of warriors who consumed their enemies to gain their strength, but Samuel understood that this was about something more fundamental than strength. This was about reclaiming their humanity through the most inhuman act imaginable. The smoke rising from the chimney carried a different scent now, something richer and more complex than the usual hickory and oak. Anyone passing by might have attributed it to a different type of wood, or perhaps a special seasoning blend. The truth was both simpler and more terrifying. It was the smell of justice being served one strip at a time, cured in salt and wood smoke until it could sustain life through the hardest winter in recorded Blue Ridge history. 4 more family members slept peacefully in the main house, unaware that their morning would begin with an empty kitchen and a mother who would never again sharpen her butcher knife against the wet stone. But the enslaved workers were just getting started. Marcus Harwick woke to silence where his wife's movements should have been. And in that first moment of consciousness, he felt something had shifted in the natural order of his mountain kingdom. The absence of familiar sounds can be more terrifying than the presence of threatening ones. This disruption in routine would cascade into discoveries that transformed a simple case of missing persons into something that challenged the very foundations of how civilized society understood justice and survival. The creak of floorboards, the rattle of pots in the kitchen, the soft humming Eleanor always did while preparing breakfast. All of these morning rhythms had vanished, leaving only the howl of February wind through the gaps in the log walls. Marcus pulled on his boots and heavy coat, assuming his wife had risen early to tend the smokehouse fires. The temperature had dropped even further during the night, and maintaining proper heat was crucial for preserving the family's winter meat supply. But Eleanor was not in the smokehouse, at least not in any form Marcus would have recognized. The building appeared normal from the outside. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney, indicating that someone had maintained the fires through the night. The door stood slightly ajar, which was unusual, but not alarming. Eleanor sometimes left it open to regulate airflow during the smoking process. Marcus approached with the casual confidence of a man who had never questioned his own safety on his own property. The interior of the smokehouse looked exactly as it should have. Fresh cuts of meat hung from the rafters in neat rows, properly spaced for optimal smoke circulation. The fires burned at the correct temperature. Even the tools had been cleaned and arranged with Eleanor's typical attention to detail. Everything was perfect, which was precisely what made it wrong. Marcus had lived on this property for over 2 decades. He knew the rhythm of the smokehouse operation, the typical quantities of meat they processed, and most importantly, the distinctive appearance of the venison and wild boar that comprised their winter food supply. The meat hanging from the rafters looked different, somehow darker, with a grain that seemed unfamiliar, cut in patterns he didn't immediately recognize. "Eleanor," he called, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The only response was the hiss of fat dripping onto hot coals and the soft whistle of wind through the chimney. Marcus examined the cutting tables where Eleanor typically worked. They had been scrubbed clean, but dark stains remained in the wood grain that seemed fresher than usual. A bucket of bloody water sat beside the main table, its surface reflecting the orange glow from the fire pit. Eleanor was meticulous about cleaning, but she never left standing water in the workspace overnight. The first real sign of trouble was Eleanor's butcher knife. She kept it sharp enough to shave with, and never left it anywhere except its designated spot on the tool rack. Now it lay on the cutting table, its blade darker than usual despite having been wiped clean. More troubling, several other knives were missing from their positions, tools that Eleanor would never have taken outside the smokehouse. David arrived as Marcus was examining the workspace. At 28, the eldest Harwick's son had inherited his father's suspicious nature and his mother's attention to detail. He immediately noticed what his father had missed. The meat hanging from the rafters was arranged in quantities that exceeded their recent hunting yields. "Where did this come from?" David asked, pointing to a particularly large section of what appeared to be hind quarter cuts. "We haven't taken a deer this size since November." Marcus didn't have an answer. The family kept careful records of their hunting and trading activities, partly for practical reasons, and partly because federal agents occasionally asked questions about their income sources. According to their ledger, they should have been running low on preserved meat, not adding new stock. William and James appeared within minutes, drawn by their father's shouts. The 4 men stood in the smokehouse, surrounded by evidence of activity they couldn't explain, searching for a woman who had simply vanished. The logical explanations that Eleanor had gone to visit neighbors or had left early for the settlement made no sense given the February weather and the isolated location. "Check the quarters," Marcus ordered. Maybe the slaves saw something, but the slave quarters were empty. All 6 people who should have been preparing for the day's work had disappeared as completely as Eleanor herself. Their few possessions remained in place, suggesting they hadn't fled in the night. Even more puzzling, the quarter showed no signs of struggle or forced removal. It was as if 6 human beings had simply evaporated into the mountain air. The Harwick men searched the property systematically. They found no tracks in the frozen ground leading away from the buildings. The family's weapons remained in their usual locations, ruling out theft as a motive. Most disturbing, the horses and livestock appeared undisturbed, suggesting that whatever had happened hadn't involved outside raiders or wild animals. By noon, Marcus had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. His wife and 6 enslaved workers had disappeared simultaneously under impossible circumstances. The only evidence of unusual activity was the extra meat in the smokehouse and the subtle wrongness that pervaded the entire property. "We need to organize a search party," William suggested. "Get men from the settlement to help us cover more ground." Marcus shook his head. "And tell them what? That 7 people vanished without leaving tracks. That we can't account for meat that shouldn't exist." He gestured toward the smokehouse. "They'll think we've lost our minds." The truth was more complex than simple embarrassment. The Harwick family's isolation was intentional and profitable. Their moonshine operation, their treatment of enslaved workers, their entire way of life depended on avoiding outside scrutiny. Bringing in searchers would invite questions they couldn't answer about many aspects of their business. David made the decision that would haunt the surviving family members for the rest of their lives. "We wait," he said. "We maintain normal routines and see if they return on their own." What would you do if faced with evidence that something terrible had happened, but admitting it meant exposing secrets that could destroy your livelihood? The Harwick men chose silence over truth, and that choice would cost them everything. That night, as the family sat down to dinner, James made an observation that chilled them all. "The meat tastes different," he said, chewing slowly. "Ritterer somehow, more complex flavor than usual." Marcus had noticed the same thing but hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. The venison stew Eleanor had been preparing, or someone had been preparing using Eleanor's recipe, had a depth of taste they'd never experienced before. It was undeniably delicious, which somehow made it more disturbing. The smoke continued rising from the chimney throughout the night, maintaining the slow cure that would preserve their winter food supply. But now the Harwick men found themselves wondering what exactly they were preserving, and whether the people they were searching for might be closer than they had imagined. Tomorrow would bring answers that no one was prepared to accept. The Harwick men woke to find their breakfast prepared exactly as Eleanor had always made it, steaming hot on the kitchen table despite no sign of who had cooked it. When hunters become prey in their own territory, the familiar becomes a weapon turned against them. This revelation would force the family to confront a truth more terrifying than simple murder. Their victims had not fled into the wilderness, but had instead claimed the Harwick property as their own. The meal consisted of Eleanor's signature cornbread, fresh butter, and strips of smoked meat arranged on her best china. The coffee was brewed to the exact strength Marcus preferred, sweetened with a precise amount of honey he had trained Eleanor to use over 20 years of marriage. Everything was perfect, which meant everything was wrong. Marcus examined the kitchen for signs of intrusion. The doors remained locked from the inside. The windows showed no evidence of tampering. Most disturbing, whoever had prepared breakfast had intimate knowledge of family routines and preferences that only Eleanor possessed. The bread had been baked in her particular pan, using her recipe that included a secret blend of spices she had never shared with anyone. "This is impossible," David muttered, studying the meat strips with growing unease. They appeared to be cut from the same stock hanging in the smokehouse, but he couldn't remember his mother preparing breakfast meat before her disappearance. James picked up one of the strips and examined it closely. The texture was different from their usual venison, more tender with a marbling of fat that suggested better nutrition than wild game typically provided. "Where would she have gotten meat like this?" he asked. "We haven't traded with anyone in weeks." The answer to that question would not become clear for several more hours, but when it did, it would reframe everything the family thought they understood about their situation. William volunteered to search the smokehouse again while the others finished breakfast. He found the building exactly as they had left it the previous day. Fires properly maintained, meat hanging in organized rows, tools cleaned and arranged with professional precision. But now he noticed details that had escaped their earlier examination. The cutting tables bore knife marks that formed unfamiliar patterns. Eleanor had always been systematic in her butchering technique, creating consistent cuts that maximized yield from each carcass. These marks suggested different hands, different methods, and most importantly, different purposes than simple food preservation. A detailed inventory revealed that someone had been very busy during the night. New cuts of meat had appeared on the drying racks, portions that would have required several hours of careful work to prepare. The quantity exceeded anything Eleanor could have accomplished alone, even if she had worked through the night. But the most disturbing discovery was a set of tools that didn't belong in the smokehouse. Hidden beneath a pile of salt curing materials, William found several items from the main house: Eleanor's sewing scissors, a carving knife from the dining room, and most chilling, a straight razor from Marcus's shaving kit. These weren't butchering tools. They were surgical instruments that suggested a level of precision and planning that went far beyond simple revenge killing. Samuel's voice came from directly behind him. "Looking for something?" William spun around to find all 6 missing people standing in the smokehouse doorway. They appeared healthy, well-fed, and completely calm. Despite having vanished for over 24 hours, Samuel held a meat cleaver loosely in his right hand, its blade reflecting the firelight. Ruth stood beside him with a filleting knife, while Joshua and Thomas flanked the entrance with tools of their own. Even young Moses carried a weapon, a thin blade that looked suspiciously like one of Eleanor's quilting needles, sharpened to a deadly point. "Where is my mother?" William demanded, trying to project authority despite the obvious shift in power dynamics. "Your mother is exactly where she belongs," Samuel replied. He gestured toward the hanging meat with casual indifference, providing sustenance for people she spent 4 years trying to starve. The implication hit William like a physical blow. The extra meat in the smokehouse, the unfamiliar textures and flavors, the breakfast prepared with impossible knowledge of family preferences. It all made sense in a way that made his stomach lurch with revulsion. "That's impossible," he whispered. "People don't. We don't." "People don't what?" Ruth asked, her voice carrying the same calm authority Samuel displayed. "People don't eat other people. Your family has been consuming human flesh for months, William. The only difference now is that you know where it came from." The historical record suggests that cannibalism was not uncommon in extreme survival situations throughout American frontier history. The Donner Party, the colonists of Jamestown, and countless other groups had resorted to consuming human flesh when facing starvation. But this was different. This was systematic, deliberate, and most disturbing. It was being presented as justice rather than desperation. Samuel approached the cutting table where William stood frozen with shock. "Your mother taught us many things during her final hours," he said conversationally. "How to properly section a carcass for maximum yield, which cuts require longer curing times, the importance of removing all bone fragments to prevent spoilage." He picked up Eleanor's butcher knife and tested its edge against his thumb. A thin line of blood appeared, but Samuel showed no reaction to the pain. "She was very educational right up until the end, even helped us understand which seasonings work best with different types of meat." William tried to back away, but Thomas and Joshua had moved to block the rear exit. The smokehouse, which had always represented security and sustenance for the Harwick family, had been transformed into a trap with the surviving family members as prey. "What do you want?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What we've always wanted," Samuel replied. "Freedom. But since your family made that impossible, we've settled for something else." He gestured toward the hooks and chains that had once held deer and wild boar. Several of them had been modified with additional restraints, leather straps and iron shackles that would hold a struggling human being securely during the butchering process. "We want justice," Samuel continued, "and we want to survive the winter. Your family has provided both." The smoke continued to rise. William realized with crystal clarity that he was not leaving the smokehouse alive, but more terrifying was the understanding that his death would be neither quick nor merciful. It would be educational, just as Eleanor's had been. He would learn exactly how it felt to be reduced to meat, seasoned and preserved for the convenience of people who had once been his property. The mountain had indeed been hungry, and now it was feeding. William Harwick's screams echoed through the valley for exactly 17 minutes before the mountain swallowed them. And in that time, 3 generations of brutality found its answer in the oldest form of justice known to humanity. When civilization fails, nature provides its own court of appeals. This systematic reversal of power would establish precedents that neighboring communities struggled to understand, creating a legend that blended historical fact with moral complexity in ways that challenged simple narratives of good and evil. The process began with Samuel explaining the rules that would govern the remainder of the Harwick family's lives. These weren't the arbitrary cruelties that had characterized their treatment of enslaved workers, but carefully considered principles based on reciprocity and survival necessity. William would experience exactly what he had helped inflict on others, no more, no less. "Your mother understood by the end," Ruth said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing weather or crop yields. She realized that every cut she had made, every beating she had supervised, every meal she had denied us was being repaid with interest. The tools arranged on the cutting table reflected years of expertise gained through processing game animals, but now they would serve educational purposes. Samuel selected a thin-bladed knife used for precise work around joints and bones. "This will hurt," he told William with clinical detachment, "but it won't kill you quickly. Your mother taught us the importance of keeping meat fresh during processing." What followed cannot be described in detail while respecting both historical accuracy and basic human dignity. Suffice it to say that William learned firsthand why the Cherokee called this place the Hungry Valley, and why his mother had made certain observations about desperate animals during her final moments of consciousness. Marcus, David, and James heard their family members suffering from inside the main house but found themselves unable to act. The doors had been barricaded from outside using techniques learned from years of fortress building against federal agents. The windows were too small for adult men to escape through, and the thick log walls that had once provided security now served as prison walls. More psychologically devastating was the realization that their weapons had been systematically removed during the night. Every rifle, pistol, knife, and even the axes used for splitting firewood had vanished. The enslaved workers had spent weeks cataloging and relocating every potential weapon on the property, leaving the Harwick men defenseless in their own home. "This is what helplessness feels like," Samuel called through the barricaded door. His voice carried clearly despite the thick wood, suggesting he had positioned himself close to the house for maximum psychological impact. "This is what your property felt like every day for 4 years." The 3 surviving Harwick men found themselves facing the same impossible choices their victims had confronted: submit to systematic brutalization, or find ways to resist that would likely result in even worse treatment. The irony was lost on none of them that their mountain fortress built to protect them from outside threats had become the perfect prison for containing them until their captives were ready. Outside, the smokehouse continued operating at peak efficiency. Thomas had proven remarkably skilled at maintaining optimal temperature and smoke density for the curing process. Joshua managed the salt curing operation with the same attention to detail Eleanor had demanded. Even young Moses contributed by tending the fires and monitoring the hanging meat for proper color and texture development. The systematic nature of the operation reflected planning that went far beyond spontaneous revenge. Samuel's group had spent months studying not just the family's routines and security measures, but the technical aspects of food preservation that would be essential for surviving the remaining winter months. They understood that killing their oppressors was only the beginning. Staying alive until spring required mastering skills that had previously been Eleanor's exclusive domain. A traveling preacher named Ezekiel Thornton passed through the valley 3 days after William's death, according to church records found in Winchester County archives. He reported seeing smoke rising from the Harwick smokehouse and assumed the family was preparing for the remaining winter months. The sight seemed so normal, so domestic that he nearly stopped to purchase some of their renowned preserved meat before deciding the weather was too harsh for social visits. Thornton's journal, discovered in 1932 during renovation of a Methodist church in Stunton, contained this observation. The Harwick property appeared prosperous and well-maintained. Smoke rose steadily from their smokehouse, and I observed several Negroes working industriously around the outbuildings, a model of mountain self-sufficiency, though I wondered at seeing no sign of the family themselves. The preacher had unknowingly witnessed the complete transformation of the property's power structure. The industrious Negroes, he observed, were no longer enslaved workers, but free people operating a successful food preservation business using techniques learned from their former captors. The absent family members were closer than he realized, hanging in neat strips from the smokehouse rafters, properly cured and seasoned for optimal nutritional value. Samuel had established a rotation system that ensured continuous operation of all essential functions. 2 people maintained the smokehouse at all times, while others managed the distillery operation that had been the family's primary source of income. They had discovered that moonshine production, when operated by people who actually understood the process rather than just supervising it, could be significantly more profitable than the Harwick family had ever achieved. The most psychologically complex aspect of their new situation was the relationship with their remaining prisoners. Marcus, David, and James were kept alive not from mercy but from practical necessity. They possessed knowledge about trade routes, customer contacts, and financial arrangements that would be essential for maintaining the property's economic viability. Each surviving family member would be processed systematically, their knowledge extracted along with their flesh until the former enslaved workers had absorbed every aspect of the Harwick business operation. Only then would the mountain claim its final payment for 4 years of accumulated debt. Ruth discovered Eleanor's recipe collection during a systematic search of the main house. The handwritten notebook contained detailed instructions for preserving various types of meat, including several entries that would prove prophetic in their current situation. One recipe titled, "Long Pork Preparation for Extended Storage," suggested that Eleanor had anticipated this exact scenario. The winter that would follow would test every survival skill the group had learned, every technique they had mastered, and every moral boundary they had crossed. But as smoke continued rising from the chimney, and the supplies in their improvised larder grew more substantial each day, one thing became clear: the hungry valley would finally be fed. Spring arrived 2 months late in 1848, but by then the Har property had been transformed into something that defied every assumption about justice, survival, and the price of freedom in antebellum America. When the last snow melted, it revealed a truth that would challenge historians for generations to come. This final transformation would determine whether the events in the Blue Ridge Mountains represented simple revenge or something more complex, a complete inversion of power that created its own moral universe. The thaw began in early May, according to weather records preserved in the Virginia State Archives. As mountain streams swelled with snowmelt and the first wildflowers appeared in sheltered hollows, travelers began moving through the passes again after months of winter isolation. The first to reach the Harwick property was a federal revenue agent named Joseph McKinley, investigating reports of continued moonshine production despite the family's alleged disappearance. McKinley's official report, filed on May 15, 1848, described a prosperous-looking operation with well-maintained buildings, active distillation equipment, and clear evidence of successful food preservation activities. The smokehouse chimney showed signs of recent use, and the agent noted an abundance of preserved meat stocks that suggest either successful hunting or profitable trading relationships. What McKinley couldn't have known was that he was looking at the most successful business transformation in Blue Ridge history. Samuel's group had not merely survived the winter, they had thrived in ways that exceeded anything the Harwick family had achieved during 20 years of operation. The moonshine produced under their management was significantly higher quality than previous batches, primarily because the people doing the actual work now understood every aspect of the process rather than simply following orders. They had experimented with different grain ratios, fermentation times, and distillation techniques, creating a product that commanded premium prices from discriminating customers. More importantly, they had established direct relationships with buyers who had previously dealt only with Marcus Harwick. Samuel's natural intelligence, combined with literacy skills acquired in secret during his enslavement, made him an effective negotiator who understood that knowledge was more valuable than brute force in business dealings. The food preservation operation had expanded beyond simple survival necessity into something approaching commercial enterprise. The techniques perfected during the winter months, the optimal salt ratios, smoking temperatures, and curing times had produced preserved meat of exceptional quality. Their inventory included not just the remains of the Harwick family, but also deer, wild boar, and other game obtained through hunting and trading. Ruth had proven particularly skilled at developing recipes that maximized nutritional value while disguising the origins of their more controversial ingredients. Her seasoning blends, derived partly from Eleanor's notes and partly from traditional African cooking techniques, created flavors that were both distinctive and marketable. The children Moses and Sarah had adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience typical of young people facing extreme situations. They had learned advanced skills in food processing, business operations, and most importantly, the art of maintaining secrets that adults would find disturbing. Agent McKinley's investigation revealed no evidence of the missing Harwick family, but this absence was explained by Samuel as a business arrangement. The family decided to relocate to Richmond for the winter. He told the agent, "Left us to maintain the property until their return." The explanation seemed plausible enough that McKinley filed no additional reports. But the agent's visit forced Samuel's group to confront a fundamental question. What would happen when the larger world began asking more detailed questions about the Harwick family's disappearance? The solution they developed reflected the same systematic thinking that had characterized their revolt. Rather than attempting to maintain the fiction indefinitely, they would gradually establish themselves as the property's legitimate operators. Samuel began presenting himself as a freedman hired by the Harwicks to manage their affairs. While the others claimed to be free workers earning wages for specialized skills, the legal complexity of this transformation reflected broader tensions in antebellum Virginia society. Slave revolts were the nightmare that haunted every slaveholder, but the legal system struggled with cases where enslaved people successfully defended themselves or claimed property rights. Samuel's group occupied a legal gray area that local authorities preferred not to examine too closely. By the summer of 1848, the former Harwick property was operating as a legitimate business under Samuel's management. Customers who had dealt with the family for years noticed improved product quality and more reliable service, but attributed these changes to better management practices rather than questioning the underlying ownership structure. The smokehouse continued operating throughout the summer, though its inventory gradually shifted toward more conventional sources as hunting and trading provided adequate meat supplies. The Harwick family's remains had been consumed entirely by late spring, their nutritional contribution having sustained 6 people through the harshest winter in regional memory. Ruth kept detailed records of their consumption, partly for practical inventory management and partly for reasons that remained unclear even to her companions. Her notebooks, discovered decades later, contained precise measurements of yield, nutritional analysis, and comparative taste evaluations that read like academic research rather than survival documentation. The psychological impact of their survival strategy created lasting changes in how the group related to food, to each other, and to the concept of justice itself. They had crossed boundaries that civilized society considered absolute, but they had done so in service of survival and freedom, rather than cruelty or profit. Local communities began referring to the property as the freedman's place, acknowledging the change in ownership without investigating its origins too closely. The mountain culture valued results over legal technicalities, and Samuel's group had proven their competence in ways that commanded respect, if not always understanding. But certain neighbors remembered details that didn't align with official explanations. They recalled the timing of the family's disappearance, the continuation of smokehouse operations throughout the winter, and most troubling, the exceptional quality of preserved meat that had been offered for trade during the harshest months. These fragments of suspicion would eventually coalesce into stories that transformed historical events into legend, creating a narrative that served multiple purposes for different audiences. For some, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of treating enslaved people with excessive cruelty. For others, it represented proof that certain boundaries should never be crossed, regardless of provocation. But for the people who had lived through those winter months, it was simply the price of freedom in a world that offered no other options. The hungry valley had been fed, and now it was time to discover what it had become. The last person to claim first-hand knowledge of the Harwick property died in 1923, but her final words ensured that the truth would never be completely buried beneath the comfortable lies that communities tell themselves about their past. When history becomes legend, the most dangerous stories are the ones that refuse to stay dead. This final chapter would determine whether the events of 1847 represented an isolated incident or something more fundamental about the price of freedom in a society built on human bondage. Martha Delacqua was 94 years old when she summoned her grandson to her deathbed in Stunton, Virginia. According to family records donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1968, she had been born on a neighboring property just 5 miles from the Harwick homestead and had lived through the entire period of the family's disappearance and the subsequent transformation of their property. Her grandson, Thomas Diacroix, initially dismissed her final revelations as the confused memories of an elderly woman approaching death. But Martha's account contained details that aligned too precisely with documented historical events to be entirely fictional. More importantly, she possessed physical evidence that had been hidden for over 7 decades. "They weren't cannibals," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the mountain wind rattling her bedroom windows. "They were free people doing what free people do, surviving by any means necessary." Thomas expected typical deathbed confessions about minor sins or family secrets. Instead, Martha revealed knowledge that challenged everything he thought he understood about his family's history and the moral foundations of their mountain community. She described visiting the property in the spring of 1848 as a young woman accompanying her father on a trading expedition. The family had always purchased moonshine and preserved meat from the Harwicks, and the disappearance of the family had not interrupted their business relationship with whoever was now managing the operation. "Samuel was the smartest man I'd ever met," Martha recalled. "He could calculate measurements in his head faster than my father could write them down. Ruth's cooking was better than anything we'd ever tasted. The children were polite and well-educated. They seemed like any other successful mountain family. But Martha had noticed details that her father and other adults chose to ignore. The exceptional quality of the preserved meat despite no evidence of recent hunting success, the subtle modifications to the smokehouse that suggested different operating procedures than the Harwick family had used, most tellingly, the complete absence of any trace of the previous owners, despite claims that they had merely relocated to Richmond. "I knew something had happened," she told Thomas, "but I also knew it wasn't my place to ask questions. Mountain people survive by minding their own business." Martha's most significant revelation concerned a conversation she had overheard between Samuel and her father during their final trading visit in late 1848. Samuel had offered to sell the property and relocate his family to Ohio, where legal complexities about their status would be less problematic. The negotiation had progressed to the point of discussing specific terms and transfer documents, but the sale never occurred. According to Martha's recollection, Samuel and his family simply vanished one autumn night, leaving behind a prosperous operation and taking only personal possessions that could be carried on foot. The property was eventually claimed by distant Harwick relatives who found it completely empty except for basic equipment and a smokehouse that had been thoroughly cleaned and sealed. Thomas asked the obvious question: where had Samuel's family gone? Martha reached beneath her mattress and withdrew a small wooden box that had been hidden there for decades. Inside was a collection of items that told a story more complex than simple disappearance. A hand-carved wooden button that matched descriptions of Samuel's clothing, a child's hair ribbon that had belonged to Sarah. Most significantly, a letter written in Samuel's distinctive handwriting and addressed to whoever finds this place next. The letter dated October 15, 1848 read in part, "We leave this property to those who can make better use of it than we could. The mountain gave us what we needed to survive, but survival is not the same as living. Freedom requires more than just the absence of chains. It requires the ability to choose your own moral boundaries. We have learned that some choices once made cannot be unmade. The valley will always be hungry, but we will no longer be the ones feeding it." Martha's final revelation concerned the fate of Samuel's group. They had not simply vanished, but had joined one of the Underground Railroad networks operating in Western Virginia. Her family had maintained contact with them for several years as they moved north toward Canada, eventually settling in a community of formerly enslaved people near Detroit. Samuel became a teacher, Martha whispered. Ruth opened a restaurant that became famous throughout Michigan. The children grew up free and educated. They made new lives that had nothing to do with what they'd had to do to survive that winter. But the mountain property retained its reputation long after the people who created it had moved on. Neighboring families continued to report strange phenomena around the former Harwick homestead. Unexplained smoke rising from the sealed smokehouse, the sound of voices carrying on the wind during winter nights, and most persistently, the smell of cooking meat that seemed to drift through the valley even when no one lived there. These reports created a folklore tradition that transformed historical events into cautionary tales designed to serve multiple audiences. For white families, the stories emphasized the dangers of treating enslaved people with excessive cruelty. For black communities, they represented proof that resistance was possible, even under the most extreme circumstances. The legal aftermath of the Harwick case influenced Virginia's slave codes in ways that historians have only recently begun to understand. The complete disappearance of a slave-holding family combined with evidence of successful property management by their former slaves challenged assumptions about the intellectual and organizational capabilities of enslaved people that supported the entire system of human bondage. Thomas Delroy eventually donated his grandmother's materials to the Virginia Historical Society, where they remained largely unstudied until the 1980s. Recent archaeological investigations of the former Herrick property have uncovered evidence that supports many of Martha's claims, including modifications to the smokehouse and distillery that reflect techniques unknown to white operators of the period. The most significant finding was a hidden chamber beneath the smokehouse floor that contained personal effects from all members of both the Harwick family and Samuel's group. The arrangement suggested a deliberate memorial rather than casual disposal items arranged with care and marked with dates that corresponded to specific events during the winter of 1847 to 1848. Modern forensic analysis of bone fragments found at the site has confirmed that at least 4 adult humans were processed through the smokehouse during the period in question. The techniques used reflect sophisticated understanding of food preservation methods combined with ritualistic elements that suggest the consumption served purposes beyond simple nutrition. The Hungry Valley claimed its payment in full, and the debt was satisfied with interest that compounded across generations. But some say on winter nights when the mountain wind carries the scent of wooden smoke through the hollows, you can still smell something cooking in the ruins of the Harwick smokehouse. Something that reminds you that justice, like hunger, is never fully satisfied. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops, or 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 subscribe before it drops, or